Everybody like and subscribe, praise the bell icon. Story number 1.
It was a late summer night, the air thick and heavy with the promise of a storm. Anna had always loved thunderstorms, the rumbling thunder, the crackling lightning. But tonight felt different. The wind howled, and the sky seemed to be bruised with the dark, ominous clouds that rolled in faster than she had ever seen. She was staying at her uncle's old, isolated farmhouse on the edge of town, far from the nearest neighbor. The house, though charming in its own way, felt old and forgotten, dusty, creaky floors, and heavy drapes that never seemed to keep out the dark. As the storm picked up outside, the power flickered and then died, plunging the house into complete darkness. The only sounds were the storm's rage and the occasional creak of the old house, making the atmosphere tense and unsettling. Anna found a flashlight in the kitchen and sat by the window, watching as the trees bent and twisted under the force of the wind. Her heart raced, not from the storm, but from the feeling that something was wrong. It was around midnight when the strange noises began. At first, it was just the sound of something dragging against the floor. Anna tried to convince herself it was just the house settling, an old building full of secrets. But then the dragging sound came again, closer this time. Her breath caught in her throat. She gripped the flashlight, feeling its cold metal against her fingers. The sounds weren't random. They had a pattern, a purpose. Suddenly, a loud bang from upstairs made her jump. Her pulse hammered in her chest. She was alone. Her uncle had left hours ago for a trip into town, and she was supposed to be here alone for the weekend. The wind outside screamed louder, and the power lines crackled as if nature itself was trying to warn her. Slowly, Anna rose from her spot by the window, her feet light against the wooden floor. She crept toward the stairs. Each step creaked beneath her weight, betraying her position, but she couldn't stop herself. Something in the house, something ancient, called her upstairs. She wasn't sure what she was expecting, but it wasn't the sight that greeted her at the top of the stairs. The hallway was unnaturally cold, and the walls seemed to pulse with a life of their own. She approached the door to the attic, where the dragging sounds had been coming from. The door was cracked open, and through the gap she could see the faintest glow. Not from a light, there was no power, but from something far more sinister. Anna pushed the door open, her breath hitched as she stepped inside, the flashlight trembling in her hand. The room was full of old boxes and furniture covered in sheets. But in the center of the room was something far worse, a figure hunched and deformed, its limbs twisted at unnatural angles. It was dragging itself slowly across the floor, its face obscured by a tangled mass of hair. But she could see the glint of pale, dead eyes staring back at her. A flash of lightning illuminated the room, casting long, eerie shadows across the walls. For a split second, Anna saw something written in the dust on the floor, something that made her blood run cold. It was a name, her uncle's. The figure stopped moving. It twisted its head toward her, its mouth opening in a horrific grin. She could hear its ragged breath, feel the weight of its gaze. It was as if the storm had brought it to life, something dark and vengeful, waiting for her. Then, just as suddenly it moved, faster than humanly possible, and Anna screamed. She turned to run, but the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. Trapped, she frantically tried to push it open, but it wouldn't budge. The storm outside grew louder, the wind shrieking as the creature advanced toward her. She could feel it closing in, could hear its breath on her neck. Just when she thought she couldn't escape, there was another lightning strike, and the door flew open. She didn't hesitate. She bolted down the stairs, her heart pounding in her chest. The creature's footsteps echoed behind her, but when she reached the front door, it wouldn't open. Panic set in as the storm raged outside. Desperate, Anna slammed her body against the door, and with a final crash, it gave way. She stumbled out into the rain, looking back just in time to see the creature's silhouette in the doorway. It grinned at her, its pale eyes gleaming in the darkness. She never went back to that farmhouse. Her uncle returned the next day, baffled at the state of the house, but he never asked why Anna had left so abruptly. As for the storm, it never truly stopped. Each time thunder rumbled through the sky, she could feel its presence, lurking just out of sight, waiting for the next storm to come.
Story number 2.
It was the middle of the night, and Lucas had just finished working a late shift at the local diner. The streets were empty, save for the occasional gust of wind that pushed loose trash down the sidewalks. His car, an old sedan that had seen better days, sat parked in the nearly deserted lot, its headlights flickering as he slid into the driver's seat. The weather had been unusually foggy all week, and tonight was no different. The thick fog clung to the pavement, wrapping around the streetlights and casting a pale, ghostly glow. Lucas didn't mind it. In fact, it was peaceful. The fog had a way of making everything feel distant, isolated, a kind of calm before the storm. He started the car and pulled out of the lot, the engine sputtering to life as he made his way down the dimly lit roads. As he drove further into town, the fog seemed to grow denser, almost swallowing the world around him. The streetlights blurred, and the houses on either side of the road appeared as dark shadows in the mist. He had driven this route 1,000 times before, but tonight, something felt off. The air was thickened, as if the very atmosphere itself was holding its breath. He turned a corner, and that's when he saw it. A figure standing in the middle of the road. At first, it looked like a person, but as Lucas neared, the shape didn't move. It was just standing there, perfectly still, staring into the distance with what appeared to be a vacant, glassy gaze. The figure was cloaked in something that resembled a torn, dark coat, but there was something wrong about the way it hung. It didn't sway with the wind. It didn't shift at all. It was just a dark silhouette in the fog, frozen in place. Lucas slowed down, the hairs on the back of his neck prickling. He instinctively gripped the steering wheel tighter, but couldn't bring himself to look away from the figure. His car rolled closer, and the eerie stillness of the scene felt suffocating, like he was trapped in some kind of nightmare. When the car was just a few feet away, the figure suddenly moved, but not in the way a normal person would. It wasn't a slow, deliberate step or a quick turn of the head. It was as if the body jerked to life, its movements unnaturally fast, like a marionette suddenly yanked on its strings. Lucas slammed on the brakes, his heart racing. The figure turned toward him, its face obscured by the hood. The fog seemed to grow thicker, and in that moment, everything went silent. No wind, no distant sound of traffic, just a suffocating quiet. The figure's hand slowly lifted, pointing directly at Lucas. His breath caught in his throat as he stared at the dark, featureless hand. He didn't know why, but he couldn't move. It was as if some force beyond his control was holding him in place. And then, just as quickly as it had moved, the figure vanished into the fog, as if it had never been there at all. Lucas's foot finally moved, slamming the accelerator to the floor. The car lurched forward, tires screeching as he sped away, not daring to look in the rearview mirror. The fog swallowed everything behind him. It felt like the air itself was pushing him away from whatever had just happened. He didn't stop until he got home, and even then, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The figure had felt wrong. Something about the way it moved, the way it appeared out of nowhere. It wasn't natural. He tried to brush it off as exhaustion, but as he stepped inside his apartment, a strange sense of dread lingered. The next morning, Lucas went out to his car to find it covered in a thin layer of mist, despite the fact that the fog had lifted overnight. He wiped the condensation off the windshield and froze. On the passenger side window, written in what appeared to be finger marks, were 3 words. "It's still here." His heart sank. He couldn't deny it anymore. Something had followed him home. The group of friends had always wanted to camp out in the woods, away from the noise of the city. They decided that this weekend would be the one. A weekend to get back to nature, to sit around a fire, tell stories, and enjoy the simple things. They drove out to a secluded forest spot, far from any road, and set up their tents as the sun began to set. The woods were eerily quiet, the only sounds being the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. As night fell, they gathered around the campfire, roasting marshmallows and cracking jokes. But the deeper into the night they went, the more uneasy one of the friends, Tim, began to feel. He couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. It was as if someone or something was watching them from the trees. Tim tried to ignore it, but every time he glanced into the darkness beyond the campfire's glow, he felt eyes on him. The others didn't seem to notice, too busy with their laughter and conversation. At around midnight, They decided to go to bed. Tim was the last to enter his tent, looking back one last time at the flickering firelight and the shadows stretching out into the woods. He zipped up his tent and lay in his sleeping bag, trying to force himself to relax. That's when he heard it, a soft, deliberate crunching of leaves just outside his tent. His heart skipped a beat. He held his breath, straining to hear. The sound came again, followed by a low, guttural growl that sent chills down his spine. Tim's mind raced. He wasn't alone. There was something out there, something that had been watching them. He reached for his flashlight, but before he could grab it, the sound of footsteps came closer. Slow, deliberate steps, too slow to be human, too deliberate to be an animal. He sat up in his tent, holding his breath, trying not to make a sound. The steps stopped right outside his tent. The air grew heavy, thick with the presence of something watching him. He felt a rush of cold, as if the temperature had dropped 20 degrees in an instant. The flashlight flickered in his hand. Then, just as quickly as it had started, the sound stopped. Tim waited for what felt like an eternity before he dared to unzip his tent. He poked his head out, scanning the dark woods, but saw nothing. Relieved, he crawled back into his sleeping bag, telling himself it was just his imagination. He closed his eyes, determined to get some rest. But then, just before he fell asleep, he heard a whisper, so soft and close it felt like it was right beside his ear. "You should have left." He bolted upright, his heart pounding in his chest. The whisper had come from inside the tent. He wasn't alone. He ripped open the tent door, stumbling out into the cold night, his friends still asleep in their tents. But as he looked around, there was no sign of anyone or anything, just the dense, suffocating woods. The next morning, the friends woke to find Tim's tent completely empty. His sleeping bag was still inside, but Tim was gone. There were no signs of struggle, no footprints leading into the woods. It was as if he had simply vanished into thin air. They searched the woods for hours, but Tim was never found. The only thing they discovered was a single footprint, deep in the mud, just outside Tim's tent. And at the center of the print, a strange symbol, carved into the earth, something ancient, something not meant to be seen. They never returned to that place. And to this day, no one knows what happened to Tim. But every now and then, when the fog is thick and the wind howls through the trees, someone swears they hear footsteps behind them, slow and deliberate, and a whisper carried on the wind. "You should have left."
Story number 3.
It was supposed to be a quick trip, a weekend getaway to a small, picturesque cabin in the woods. Laura and her boyfriend, James, had been looking forward to it for weeks. They arrived just after dark, the sun already having dipped behind the trees, casting the world into an early twilight. The cabin was charming, a quaint little structure with a stone chimney and wooden beams, nestled in the heart of the forest. It seemed perfect for a quiet weekend alone. They unloaded their bags and settled in, lighting a fire in the hearth as they sat together, sipping wine and enjoying the warmth. The night outside was still and quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. But as the fire crackled and the shadows danced across the walls, Laura started to feel uneasy. It wasn't anything specific, just a sense of being watched, of something lurking just beyond the edge of the firelight. She brushed it off as nerves, perhaps a result of being in the woods, so far away from civilization. But as the night wore on, the feeling grew stronger, more pressing. At one point, while James was in the bathroom, Laura decided to step outside for some fresh air. The air was thick with the scent of pine, the sky overcast with a blanket of dark clouds. As she stood there, staring into the woods, she heard a soft sound, like a twig snapping, but it was distant, almost too quiet to be real. She turned her head quickly, expecting to see James returning, but the space behind her was empty. The wind picked up and she shivered. She turned back to the cabin and went inside, locking the door behind her. As she did, she heard something, a tap at the window. Startled, she rushed over, expecting to see James with his usual playful grin, but the window was empty. Confused, she scanned the room. No one was there. "James?" she called out, but there was no response. Panic began to rise in her chest. She checked the bathroom, the kitchen, the other rooms, but he was gone. She hadn't heard the front door open, and she was certain she hadn't heard him leave. Her mind raced as she searched the cabin, but it was when she returned to the living room, that something caught her attention. The fire had burned down to nothing but glowing embers, casting long, flickering shadows against the walls. But one of the shadows wasn't right. There, in the corner of the room, barely visible in the dim light, was the shape of a person. At first, it looked like James, standing completely still, staring at her. But there was something horribly wrong. The figure didn't move, didn't blink. It was just standing there, eerily silent, watching her, her breath caught in her throat. She backed away slowly, heart pounding in her chest. And then, just as she was about to turn to run, the figure stepped forward. But it wasn't James. It was something different, twisted. Its limbs too long, its skin pale and stretched tight over its bones. Its face was distorted, eyes black and empty, its mouth twisted into a grin that stretched far too wide. Laura screamed and bolted for the door. But as she reached for the handle, the door slammed shut, trapping her inside. The thing in the corner let out a low, guttural laugh, and she knew, deep down, that it wasn't just standing there. It had been waiting for her. She scrambled to find another way out. The windows, locked. The back door, blocked. There was no escape. Then, from the darkness behind her, a voice whispered, "You shouldn't have come here." And the last thing Laura saw before the darkness consumed her was the thing's face, inches away, its grin widening, as it whispered, "You're ours now." The old house had been abandoned for as long as anyone could remember. It sat at the end of a narrow, winding road, surrounded by overgrown trees and tangled vines. Local kids used to dare each other to go inside, but no one ever stayed for long. Rumors swirled about what had happened there, whispers of disappearances, of strange sounds in the night, of shadows that moved on their own. But for Sarah and her friends, the rumors were just that, stories meant to scare people. So when they found themselves on a late-night road trip, they couldn't resist checking it out. They parked in front of the house, the headlights illuminating the broken windows and the crumbling facade. It was everything the rumors said it would be, creaky, decaying, with a sense of weight in the air, as though the house itself was holding its breath. "I'll go first," Sarah said, grabbing a flashlight and stepping out of the car. Her friends laughed nervously, but followed her toward the front door. The door creaked loudly when Sarah pushed it open, the hinges groaning in protest. Inside, the house smelled musty, damp, like it hadn't been touched in decades. Dust hung thick in the air, and the floorboards creaked beneath their feet as they moved deeper into the house. They explored room after room, but there was nothing in the house. No furniture, no signs of life, just peeling wallpaper and shattered glass. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of their footsteps. As they made their way upstairs, Sarah felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. Something wasn't right. The air felt heavy, oppressive, like it was getting harder to breathe. When they reached the top of the stairs, they found a door at the end of the hall, slightly ajar. Sarah nudged it open, her flashlight sweeping the room. The light fell on something that made her blood run cold. A child's room, but not like any child's room she'd ever seen. The walls were covered in strange, faded drawings scribbled in what looked like red chalk. And in the corner, sitting perfectly still, was a doll. It was a grotesque thing, its face cracked and covered in layers of grime. Its eyes were wide open, staring blankly at the group. Then, without warning, the door slammed shut behind them. They spun around, but it was too late. The room was no longer empty. In the doorway stood a tall figure, cloaked in shadow, its face obscured, and behind it, something small, something childlike, moving in the dark. The air went cold as a low voice whispered, "You shouldn't have come here." The flashlight flickered and died, plunging them into total darkness. And when they heard the footsteps behind them, slow and deliberate, they realized some stories are true. Some things are better left alone.
Story number 4.
It was a quiet, overcast afternoon when Sarah's family decided to visit her grandmother's old house out in the country. The house had been in her family for generations, passed down from great-grandparents to grandparents, and then to her mother. But after her grandmother passed away, the house had been abandoned, left to rot in the middle of nowhere. Sarah, her brother Mark, and their mother had decided to go back and visit it one last time. They hadn't been there in years, and her mother wanted to see the house one final time before selling it. The moment they arrived, Sarah could feel something was off. The house, though still standing, looked almost lifeless. The windows were clouded with dust, and the door creaked as they entered. The air inside felt stale, thick, as if it had been locked away for far too long. "Grandma's house always felt empty, didn't it?" Sarah said, trying to break the silence. Her voice echoed slightly as she stepped inside. Her mother nodded, eyes distant. "It wasn't always like this." They explored the house together, dusting off old furniture, taking a trip down memory lane. But the more they moved through the rooms, the more uneasy Sarah became. Every so often, she felt a strange sensation, as though someone was watching her. It wasn't just the usual feeling you get when you're alone in a dark house. It was something far more sinister. As Sarah passed by the attic door, she noticed that it was slightly ajar. The door had always been locked when she was younger. Her grandmother had warned her never to go up there. But now, with her grandmother gone, the door was open. She hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest. Something about it called to her, pulled her toward it. "Sarah, don't," Mark said suddenly, standing behind her. He was pale, his eyes wide with unease. "I've got a bad feeling about the attic. Don't go up there." Sarah ignored him. She had to know what was up there. With her brother behind her, she ascended the narrow stairs, the wood groaning underfoot. When she reached the top, she hesitated before pushing open the attic door. The air in the attic smelled old, mothballs and mildew, and there was a dim light coming from the small window at the far end. But what caught her eye wasn't the old furniture or forgotten belongings. It was the figure standing in the far corner. It looked like a person. No, it was a person, but something was wrong. The figure was hunched over, its back arched at an unnatural angle. Its head was turned in a way that defied physics, its face hidden in the shadows. Sarah couldn't make out any details, but she could feel its presence, something dark and unnatural in the way it stood there. Suddenly, the figure turned toward her. It was fast, too fast, almost as if it had been waiting for her all along. The air grew colder, and Sarah could see the figure's face now, pale, twisted, and grinning in a way that no person ever should. Before Sarah could react, she felt a cold hand on her shoulder. She screamed and spun around, but there was no one there. The attic door slammed shut behind her, trapping her inside with the thing. She banged on the door, screaming for help, but all she heard in response was a low, guttural laugh from behind her. It was as if the thing was enjoying her terror. She turned around to find it standing right behind her, its grotesque grin stretching wider, its eyes glowing with malevolent intent. Mark and her mother finally managed to force open the attic door, but when they entered, they found the attic empty. Sarah was gone, as though she had never been there at all. They searched the house for hours, but there was no sign of her. Only a single item remained, a small weathered locket with Sarah's name engraved on it, lying on the floor of the attic. The small town of Brooksville had always been known for its tight-knit community and peaceful streets. But something was different this year. People were starting to disappear. It began with the town's elderly residents. First, Mrs. Hargrove, then Mr. Wiggins, and then more people, all vanishing without a trace. At first, the police thought it was just coincidence, but then the disappearances became impossible to ignore. No one knew where they went, and there were no signs of struggle, no clues left behind. Laura, a local journalist, was determined to uncover the truth. She had grown up in Brooksville, and the recent disappearances were haunting. She spent her days interviewing locals, piecing together what little information she could find. But the more she dug, the more she began to hear whispers about something far darker than she had ever imagined. One evening, Laura received an anonymous tip. A letter slipped under her door, with no return address, just a warning written in shaky handwriting. "It's the woods. The woods are taking them." At first, she dismissed it as nothing more than a prank. But the next morning, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something to it. So she decided to investigate. The woods surrounding Brooksville were dense and dark, a tangled mess of trees that had always felt ominous to her as a child. She had always heard rumors of strange happenings there, but they had always seemed like silly stories. Until now. Laura drove to the edge of the forest, her car headlights cutting through the mist. The trees were so thick that they seemed to swallow the light, and she felt an unease settle in her stomach as she stepped out of the car. The air was colder than it should have been, and there was a strange silence. No birds, no animals, just the oppressive weight of the woods. She walked deeper into the forest, her flashlight flickering as she moved. Her heart began to race, the feeling of being watched intensifying with every step. Then she heard something, footsteps, but not her own. They were soft, deliberate, approaching from behind. She spun around, but there was nothing there. The woods were silent again. Panic gripped her. She turned and ran, her breath heavy, her heart pounding in her chest. But the footsteps followed her, getting closer and closer. She stumbled, falling to the ground, and when she looked up, she saw something that froze her blood. There, standing just beyond the trees, was a figure. Tall, thin, and twisted, its face hidden beneath a hood. It was watching her, unmoving, like a predator waiting for its prey. And as Laura's eyes locked with the figures, she saw something horrifying. In the shadow of the trees, she saw dozens, no hundreds of similar figures, their faces obscured, standing motionless, waiting. The last thing Laura remembered before she blacked out was the chilling sound of whispers, a chorus of voices that filled the air around her, chanting one word over and over again: "Join us." When Laura was found the next morning, she was unconscious, lying just outside the woods. No one could explain what had happened, but she was never the same. Her eyes were vacant, distant, and sometimes when she thought no one was looking, she would mutter that same chant under her breath: "Join us." No one has gone into the woods since, and no one dares to ask about the figures. But the disappearances in Brooksville have stopped.
Story number 5.
It was a calm Sunday afternoon when Mia and her friend Jessica decided to explore the old, abandoned house at the edge of town. Everyone in their small community knew the house. Some called it the Hollow House. Others called it the Devil's Den. It had been empty for decades, ever since the last owners mysteriously disappeared. The rumors surrounding it were enough to make anyone hesitate, but for Mia and Jessica, it was just another chance to prove they weren't afraid of local legends. They stood in front of the crumbling house, peering through the overgrown ivy and broken windows. The house was old, decaying wood, rusted nails, and broken shingles, but there was something about it that sent a shiver down Mia's spine, as if the house had an unnatural presence. "Are we sure about this?" Mia asked, glancing at Jessica. Jessica smirked. "It's just an old house. What's the worst that can happen?" They pushed through the overgrown shrubs and stepped onto the creaky porch. The door, surprisingly, wasn't locked. With a deep breath, they entered the darkness inside. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of mildew filled their noses. The floorboards groaned under their weight as they walked into the living room, where faded wallpaper peeled from the walls, and remnants of broken furniture lay scattered across the floor. "Let's look upstairs," Jessica suggested, her flashlight beam darting around the room. Mia hesitated but followed. As they climbed the stairs, an odd chill filled the air, one that didn't feel like just the draft of an old house. It was something colder, more unnatural. At the top of the stairs, they saw a hallway, its doors hanging open, leading to what used to be bedrooms. The first room on the left was dark, its windows covered in grime, the air colder still. They stepped inside, their flashlights sweeping across the room. The floor was cluttered with papers, yellowed and crumbling with age, but it wasn't the papers that caught their attention. It was the painting. It was an old framed portrait of a man, dressed in old-fashioned clothes, staring straight ahead. His face was stern, almost angry. His eyes, though painted, seemed alive, as if following them as they moved about the room. "That's creepy," Mia muttered, stepping closer to get a better look. Jessica laughed nervously. "It's just a painting." But Mia didn't feel right. She felt like the man in the painting was watching her. And then she saw it, the faintest flicker of movement in the corner of her eye. She turned quickly, but nothing was there. She shook her head, trying to calm her nerves. "Let's go check the next room." But as they turned to leave, the door slammed shut behind them with a deafening bang. Both girls screamed in shock and turned to find the room now pitch black. The flashlight flickered and then died completely, plunging them into darkness. Before they could react, a voice, low and raspy, filled the room. "You shouldn't have come," Jessica gasped. "Who's there?" The air grew even colder, and Mia felt the hairs on the back of her neck rise. The floor beneath them creaked, and from the darkness they could hear slow, heavy footsteps approaching. "Open the door!" Mia screamed, rattling the handle. The footsteps grew closer, each step louder, until they were right behind them. Mia spun around, her heart racing, but saw nothing. The darkness seemed to close in on her, and she could feel the presence of something cold and malevolent pressing against her. And then she heard it, whispered in her ear, so close it made her jump. "You're mine." Suddenly, the door creaked open, and the light from Jessica's flashlight flickered back to life. They didn't need to say a word. Without a second thought, both girls bolted out of the room and down the stairs, through the dark hallway, and out of the house. The moment they stepped onto the porch, the door slammed shut behind them. They ran back to their car without looking back, the feeling of being chased lingering in the air around them. They didn't speak until they reached the safety of Jessica's house. "I told you it was bad news," Mia said, her voice trembling. Jessica, who had always dismissed the warnings, said nothing. She just stared at the house in the distance, its silhouette dark against the setting sun. "We never should have gone inside." After that night, neither of them returned to the house. They couldn't. But both of them swore they would never forget the eyes of that man in the portrait. How, for just a second, they saw something dark moving within them, something alive. And every now and then, in the dead of night, when the wind howled just right, they swore they could hear footsteps following them. Slow, deliberate, waiting. It was late in the evening when Matthew and his friends decided to take the long road home after a weekend camping trip in the woods. They'd spent the last few days hiking, fishing, and enjoying the outdoors, but as they packed up their gear and drove home, a sense of unease settled over the group. It wasn't the dark roads or the winding, narrow path. It was something else, something that none of them could explain. They were all quiet in the car, each of them looking out at the forest surrounding them as the headlights barely pierced the thick trees. Suddenly, they all heard it, an eerie, distant sound. A soft, high-pitched wail, almost like a child crying, carried through the still air. Matthew turned to the others, his face pale. "Did you hear that?" None of them answered. They were all listening, waiting. The sound came again, louder this time, clearer, a child's cry. Without thinking, Matthew pulled over to the side of the road. "We should check it out," he said, his voice shaky. The others agreed reluctantly, and they all stepped out of the car, the woods stretching out before them, dark and impenetrable. The crying seemed to be coming from deeper in the woods. It was haunting, desperate. It didn't sound like an animal, it was too human. They followed the sound, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. The air grew colder, and the trees seemed to close in around them, their branches scratching at their clothes as they walked deeper into the forest. Finally, they came to a clearing. The crying had stopped. In its place was an unsettling silence. And then from the shadows, they saw it. A figure, standing in the middle of the clearing. It was a little girl, no older than 7 or 8, dressed in a torn white dress. Her hair hung in messy strands around her face, and she was staring directly at them, her eyes wide and empty. "Help me," she whispered, her voice hoarse and broken. Matthew's heart raced as he stepped forward. "Where's your family?" he asked, his voice shaky. The girl's head tilted unnaturally, and for a moment, it almost looked like her face was shifting. Her smile widened, stretching too far, her eyes darkening into voids. And then she spoke again, her voice no longer that of a child. "You're lost now, too." Before anyone could react, the ground beneath them trembled, the trees groaned, and the figure in front of them began to distort, its body twisting unnaturally as if it was no longer human. Matthew and his friends froze, terror flooding their veins. The creature grinned wider, and the last thing they saw before everything went black was its eyes, empty, hollow, filled with darkness. The next morning, the police found the car abandoned by the side of the road. There were no signs of struggle, no blood, just the sound of wind rustling through the trees. As for Matthew and his friends, they were never found again. Some say that if you drive through those woods at night, you can still hear a faint, distant cry. And if you listen closely enough, you might see a figure standing just out of reach, waiting for someone else to wander too far into the dark.
Story number 6.
The storm had been raging for hours, and Claire was beginning to regret her decision to drive home in such awful weather. The rain hammered against the windshield, and the wipers struggled to keep up with the downpour. She'd been driving for what felt like forever, her headlights barely cutting through the thick fog that had rolled in with the storm. She wasn't far from home, just a few more miles down the road, but every minute seemed to stretch on longer than the last. Claire had never been a fan of driving alone at night, especially in these kinds of conditions. The dark, empty road seemed to stretch endlessly ahead, the only sounds being the roar of the storm and the hum of her car's engine. She gripped the steering wheel tighter as she tried to focus, her eyes straining to make out the road signs through the blur of rain. That's when she saw it, a figure standing by the side of the road, just up ahead. At first, Claire thought it might have been a tree, bent by the wind, or a reflection of something. But as she got closer, the figure became clearer. A person standing in the pouring rain, staring straight at her car. Her heart skipped a beat. Who would be standing out here in the middle of nowhere during a storm like this? Claire slowed down, the tension building in her chest. She could see the person's features now. A woman, drenched and standing unnervingly still. Claire felt the overwhelming urge to stop and offer help, but something inside her told her not to. There was something wrong about this, something off. As she passed the woman, Claire glanced in her rearview mirror, expecting to see the figure disappear into the rain. But the woman didn't move. She just stood there, staring at the car. A chill ran down Claire's spine. She couldn't explain why, but something felt horribly wrong. Her foot pressed down on the gas, and she drove faster, eager to get away from the strange figure. But as the miles passed, she kept feeling like she was being watched. Every now and then, she would glance in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the woman standing behind her. But there was nothing, only the endless darkness of the storm. Then, just as Claire rounded a sharp bend in the road, she saw something ahead. Another figure, this time, a man. Claire's heart slammed in her chest. Her instinct was to slam on the brakes, but she forced herself to keep driving, her knuckles white against the wheel. The man wasn't standing still like the woman. He was walking, slowly toward her. His face was obscured by the shadows, but she could tell he was moving in a strange, jerky way, like a puppet whose strings were being pulled too tightly. She glanced back again. No one was behind her, but she could still feel the same oppressive sensation of being watched. The road stretched on, dark and empty. And then, in the blink of an eye, the man was right in front of her, standing directly in the center of the road. Claire screamed, swerving violently to the side. She slammed on the brakes and jerked the wheel, her car fishtailing as she fought to regain control. The world around her seemed to spin, the rain blurring into a thick wall of water and darkness. She finally managed to steer the car off the road, bringing it to a shuddering stop in the muddy ditch. For a long moment, Claire sat there, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her heart pounding in her chest. She could still hear the rain beating against the windows, the storm still raging outside, but everything else was eerily silent. She took a deep breath, trying to calm herself, and then reached for her phone. It was dead. She groaned in frustration, looking around. The road was empty now, no sign of the woman, no sign of the man. She had no idea how she had ended up off the road, but she couldn't bring herself to move. Her mind was racing with questions. How had they gotten in front of her so quickly? And where had they come from? The area around her was completely isolated, miles from the nearest town. Then, a soft tapping on the window jolted her out of her thoughts. She spun around, her pulse skyrocketing, but there was no one there. The night outside was still, the only sound the pounding rain. But the tapping came again, louder this time. She turned slowly, dread pooling in her stomach. A pale, trembling hand pressed against the window. It wasn't the woman or the man. It was a child. Claire's breath caught in her throat as the child's face appeared at the window, eyes wide, staring directly at her. His skin was pale and slick with rain, his hair matted to his forehead. His lips moved, but Claire couldn't hear him through the glass. The tapping grew frantic. Claire fumbled for the door handle, her hands trembling, but she couldn't get it open. It was as if the car was locked, though she knew she hadn't locked it. She frantically tried again, panic rising in her chest as the child's face twisted into something almost grotesque. A smile that stretched too wide, the edges of his mouth splitting unnaturally. Without thinking, she threw the car into gear and slammed the gas pedal to the floor. The car lurched forward, kicking up mud, and with one last frantic glance over her shoulder, she saw the child vanish into the rain, his smiling face replaced by a dark shape moving in the storm. It wasn't until she reached the safety of her home that the terror began to subside. But even now, as she lay in bed, she couldn't shake the image of that child's face at the window, or the feeling that something had been waiting for her, something that was still following her, hidden in the storm. It was a strange invitation that arrived at Eliza's doorstep one Friday afternoon. The envelope was thick, its edges decorated with intricate, dark patterns. Inside, there was a single folded note that read, "You're invited to the final performance of the Midnight Theater. This Saturday, you must come alone." Eliza wasn't one to ignore odd invitations, especially when curiosity got the best of her. It was a Saturday night when she finally found the theater, a small, unassuming building tucked away on a side street she hadn't noticed before. The theater had no sign, no obvious markings, but there was a soft glow coming from the inside, casting strange, flickering shadows on the pavement. She stepped through the heavy wooden door, which creaked loudly as it opened. Inside, the air was thick, musty, and the velvet curtains that lined the walls were faded, their deep red color now tinged with age. The theater was small, barely enough seats for a dozen people, and the stage was set, a single spotlight illuminating a small chair at the center. The lights dimmed suddenly, and Eliza found herself sitting in the front row, alone. A hush fell over the room, and then the performance began. A single actor, dressed in a ragged costume, stepped onto the stage. He was gaunt, his face pale and drawn, but it was his eyes that caught Eliza's attention. Dark, hollow, and filled with something that made her stomach turn. The actor began to speak, his voice low and gravelly, as if he were reciting a dark, forgotten tale. The words sent chills down her spine, each one seeming to echo around the room. As the performance went on, the room grew colder, the air heavier, and Eliza could feel a creeping sense of dread settle in her chest. And then, in the middle of a monologue, the actor stopped. His eyes locked onto hers, and he smiled, a cold, unnatural smile. "You're the one who's been invited," he said, his voice rising to a chilling whisper. "The final performance is for you." Suddenly, the lights went out. The world around Eliza spun, and she heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving toward her. She stood, her breath coming in ragged gasps, but when the lights flickered back on, the theater was empty. The actor was gone. The chairs were empty, but Eliza could feel eyes on her, dark, watching eyes just beyond the shadows. And that's when she realized she was no longer alone.